comes the linchpin we're waiting on. Linchpin. I think that was Christopher. All right, Mike's ready to count the daily Bible readers. If you were a daily Bible reader, if you'll raise your hand, he'll get a count. Halloween is coming up, though. It's a complimentary thing. I don't know if Barry has workbooks or not. I can hear him talking, can't see him coming. Let's go ahead and start. Oh yeah, he does. Now, if you need a quarterly, Barry has some. He's going to pass down the aisle. He'll get to you. Raise your hand. I'm going to do things differently today. I'm going to do things the way I guess they're meant to be done. So we're going to read our text. Very first thing. Numbers chapter 20, verses 1 through 13. If you're looking in the quarterly, it's on page 54. And we want to read this and talk about Moses. Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Carthage. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, "If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? Is it not a place of grain? It is not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there any water to drink." So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting. And they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drank. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe me, to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them." This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. Have you ever heard the old term, same song, second verse? Well, if you were describing our text this morning, you'd say same song about fifth verse, because we've heard this over and over and over again. The Israelites were complaining, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? We're going to die here. We don't have things the way we want them." And Moses had to be getting tired of it. Any of us would have been if we had been in Moses' place. But now the difference is from this morning to back when we studied chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, and they were complaining. This was a whole different set of complainers. It looks like, judging by the fact that Miriam died, this is near the end of the 40-year wandering. Maybe the last year of the 40-year wandering. So if so, the people who lived in Egypt, who escaped Egypt, and escaped is the right word, remember they were slaves. They were treated badly. It wasn't the happy place they try to tell Moses it was when they left. But the people that escaped Egypt were dead and gone. These were their children or their grandchildren. They were another generation. But still they're complaining, just like they remembered what happened in Egypt when most of them never lived in Egypt. And if they did, they weren't old enough to remember what was going on at that time. The book of Numbers, which is what we're studying, obviously, goes over a lot of the laws about sacrifices and priests, cleanliness and purification. And it has a record of a few of the events that happened during the wandering, not many, as Israel progressed toward Canaan. Let's talk about this Kadesh Barnea. Remember, they're wandering in the desert. We call it the wilderness, but I don't want you to get the picture in your mind of they were wandering around in the forest, following these deer trails or whatever. This was a desert area. The land wouldn't grow crops. They couldn't support livestock. They were in this nomadic lifestyle, and basically they were completely dependent on God. So this Kadesh Barnea, according to Deuteronomy 1:46, this Kadesh Barnea was this oasis, what we would think of. It was a place in the desert that had water. So they would wander away and come back to Kadesh Barnea because they couldn't get far from the water. When you think about it, you can't go long without water, right? You can't survive long without water. There's just not a whole lot you can do if you don't have water around. Starvation was a constant threat to these people because they couldn't grow their own food. They couldn't raise their own meat. They were completely dependent on God. I've already said Numbers records few of the things that happened to Israel during their 40 years of wandering. It was just day followed day. Every morning they'd go out, the manna was there. Occasionally there were quail to, I guess, give them some protein for their diet. But basically it was just one day after another. It was almost like marking off a prison sentence. If we're not careful, sometimes we live our lives like that. We live for the next event, and we don't take advantage of every day like we ought to. When they were too far from the springs that were there at Kadesh Barnea, God would miraculously provide water. We had seen a record before of God doing this, and in that case, by the way, I want to throw in to confuse things for later. God told Moses to strike the rock, and water came forth. Turn to Deuteronomy 29, verses 5 and 6. And my purpose for reading that is I want you to see a little bit, or be reminded of how this life they were living happened. It probably took them a while to realize, but their shoes weren't wearing out. They were traveling, and their shoes weren't wearing out. Their clothes weren't rotting. There was obviously something at work here. Deuteronomy 29, verses 5 and 6. I have led you for 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out on you. Your sandal has not worn out on your foot. You have not eaten bread, nor have you drunk wine or strong drink, in order that you might know that I am the Lord your God. They had this cloud to follow during the day. They had the fire at night that they could see. It had to be a comfort to them to know that God was there. He was protecting them. He was taking care of them. Yes. It's a good point. The one of the hardest things to know about parenting is when to help your child and when to let them fall on their face. And more and more, I think, we've tried to protect our children so much that we've not given them the chance to make their own decisions and learn from their mistakes and that kind of thing. And these people had everything provided for them. They didn't plant crops. They didn't build houses. And that's about where I'm too. think about what we know about the land of Canaan. When they went into the land of Canaan, some lessons from now, but when they finally get to go to Canaan, they're going to walk in and live in houses that somebody else built, sit in furniture that somebody else gathered up if they had furniture, eat crops that they didn't put out. And when you think about it, or when I thought about it last night when I was writing all this lesson down, what I thought was it almost had to be that way. They hadn't planted crops in 40 years. They hadn't built houses in 40 years. All the tradesmen, all the people who knew how to do anything had died off. And basically these trades and these abilities to grow crops and that type of thing had to be learned again because Father didn't teach Son, this is how you do this. This is how you do that. All they did was follow around picking up the things that God gave them. So Jackie's exactly right. They were like spoiled children. And that's one reason they were so quick to complain, I think. I think sometimes there's a whole lot of truth to that. I'm going to jump ahead and teach Jackie's lesson next week real quick. The complaints this week, I think, and the author points this out, lead to the push next week to try to go through Edom. You're going to find as you read next week's lesson, if they could take this shortcut through Edom, they're not far from Canaan. Canaan was the promised land. Canaan was where they were going. Canaan was their reward as far as they could see, and it was. Well, these complaints apparently fueled Moses to send people to try to get permission to go through Edom. And this is all the emphasis for what you're going to see next week. But back to this week. In response to the people complaining, Moses and Aaron, unlike me, I think I sure would have, by now, I would have been so mad I would have been wanting to kill somebody. But they didn't treat them like that. Moses and Aaron listened to their complaints. Look down in verse 6 of where we just read. They turned around, they left the presence of the assembly, they went to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. So they handled this exactly the way it should be. They didn't get mad, they didn't speak to the people yet. Instead, they just turned, went to God, and asked Him, okay, what should we do? And they patiently asked, and then they sat and waited patiently, apparently, for God's answer. And especially after the last 2 or 3 lessons we have studied, you would almost expect, and I think Moses and Aaron expected God just to go off and say again, I'm going to wipe the whole generation off the face of the earth and start completely over. Remember a lesson or 2 ago when we studied that, where that was the offer that God made Moses? If you'll stand back, Moses, I'll kill them all, and I'll raise a whole new kingdom from your descendants, and you'll get to be the Abraham. I think that's what Moses was expecting to hear, but it wasn't. God realized apparently that the generation that had been complaining for so long was gone. This was a new generation. I don't know that He excused them, but maybe He thought this is all they've ever seen is complaining. That's all they know. But for some reason He was more patient with them than He was the others. Instead of berating the Israelites for their lack of trust in God's provisions, the leaders demonstrated trust by seeking and awaiting an answer from the Lord regarding how to deal with the complainers. So basically, again, Moses and Aaron sat and waited to hear the answer. But look at chapter 20, verse 8. God tells Moses what to do. Read it carefully. Moses should have listened carefully. Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water from them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation from their animals. Now, the rod. This was the same rod that when God first was strongly encouraging Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. If you'll remember, Moses had a rod in his hand, and God said, "What is that in your hand?" And immediately God turned it to a snake, a serpent. And then he turned it right back into a rod, just to show him the power, I think, that he could do. And if you'll remember later, when Moses finally gets to appear before Pharaoh, they do the same trick. It's the same rod in Exodus 4:17 that God told Moses, "And you shall take this rod in your hand, with which you shall do the signs." In Exodus 14:16, it's the rod that Moses held up when God divided the waters of the Red Sea. In Exodus 17:9, when Israel was locked in mortal combat with the Amalekites, remember, as long as he held the rod over his head, the Israelites prevailed. And when he got tired and he couldn't hold the rod up anymore, the Amalekites would prevail. And finally, they helped him hold the rod up. And eventually the Israelites won the battle. But there wasn't anything magic about that rod. It was a vision, it was something the people could see that would remind them of God's power. But the power was with God. It wasn't with the rod. And all Moses had to do was speak to the rock. Okay, now, I guess the whole point of today's lesson, I want to ask you something. What was Moses' sin? And why was it so bad he couldn't go into the promised land, the land he'd worked for so hard for so long?
He took credit for it. He did. He said, "Why must we, him and Aaron, must we bring forth water from this rock?" He didn't give God the glory for it.
You know, sometimes we talk of Moses' pride. Maybe it got the best of him. Sometimes we talk about how he let his anger control him. But I don't think that was it. Now, those are all things he did wrong, I guess. And we all do it. Yes, W.A.? He did. And if you go back to what caused this, why it happened, I think Moses fell in, and the author talks about this a little bit, but I think Moses fell into the same trap that the 10 spies fell into. If he had just given God the glory, if he had just had the faith to follow his word for word, not try to add to, not try to improve on. If he had just think about the 10 spies. They saw the grape clusters that were so big it had to be carried between two men. Can you imagine that? They saw the wonders of this land. If they had just given God the glory that, hey, God, you're so wonderful because you've brought us to this land and we can have it. You've given it to us if we'll just follow what you say and go on. But instead, they didn't have that faith. And I'm not sure that Moses had the faith to follow God, even as many wonders and signs and everything that he had seen. Not only that he had seen, but that had been worked through him. But he still didn't listen carefully and didn't do things the way God told him to. He just didn't have the faith to follow God's word to the letter. Read verse 12 one more time. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel. Therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which I have given them. Think about this. If Moses had obeyed God to the letter, if he hadn't gotten angry, if he hadn't been rash and struck that rock and said, think about what Don said, we. If he hadn't said we, if he'd said God's the one that's given you this, and spoken, and the rock would have gushed water just as it did anyway. They got the water either way. And they survived. But it was the way Moses handled it. That's the reason Moses got punished. But had he done it correctly, instead of viewing the nice view from the top of a mountain, he would have gotten to spent his last days there in the promised land. Would have been a lot nicer life. And he would have achieved the goal that he worked really hard for. It's easy for me to say after reviewing it all and looking at it that, Moses worked really hard to get to go to the promised land. And he did most of what you told him to do. I could rationalize this away from Moses. Kind of like we rationalize our own sins and our own shortcomings away. But maybe we see the other side to God here. God is a loving God. God wants to provide for us. He wants us to live a good life and be happy with our lives. But capital B, capital U, capital T, God is a punishing God. God didn't let Moses go into the promised land because Moses didn't do exactly what he told him to do. There's another side to God, and it's the one that we ought to fear. Fear is the right word. We ought to love him, of course, but we ought to fear him also. There's two sides to this coin.
You have those today in religion, John. They think grace covers everything. We don't have to obey anything. Their whole pretext in their religion is they don't have to obey. God's grace will cover them, whether they disobey or not. What is the use of the Old Testament as a tutor and a schoolmaster, but not to learn that when you disobey God, God punishes you for it?
There have been lots of preachers who have made a career out of telling people how great God is and how he loves them. And that's all true. But that's not all. And that's the fun part to talk about, and it's the easy part to talk about. But there's more to it. There's two sides, I guess.
One thing I noticed is God didn't say Moses don't hit that rock. And sometimes we use that logic that God didn't say I couldn't do this.
We make that exact argument. You're exactly right, Chris. But God didn't. But he told him what to do, and he didn't do it exactly. And it's easy for me to say, boy, God, that was pretty nitpicky. But God told him what to do.
Well, it goes back to the old adage, you cannot understand the New Testament, God's plan of salvation, if you don't know the Old Testament way of doing things very seriously. You have to know it to be able to understand the New Testament. We have a world of people today that don't understand the Old Testament because they don't understand the New Testament.
I want to read this applications out of the quarterly real quickly because it I think, explains the lesson pretty well. Although 40 years and an entire generation had passed since Israel exited Egypt, the complaints issued by the second generation were hardly different from those raised by their fathers. The hardships of wilderness life led the people to grumble against Moses, Aaron, and ultimately God. Having witnessed God's dealings with the former generation, people who neither trusted nor appreciated God, Moses expected the Lord to punish the latest group of Israelites in a manner similar to what he had done before. But God did not react as Moses expected. Instead, he was gracious and merciful and made provisions for the people. God did not hold the second generation accountable for their father's sins. He gave them an opportunity to do differently. In a similar manner, he does not hold us responsible for the actions of those around us. God looks at each case individually. That's a blessing, and it can be a curse. It doesn't matter how good my parents were. It's how I live. The second point, as great a man as Moses was, he was still human. Moses was subject to the same temptations that are common to all. When he struck the rock in Numbers 20, he allowed anger an opportunity to work in his life. This is regrettable, for the wrath of man does not produce the righteousness of God. James 1:20. I need that tattooed on my forehead. When I get mad, I just lose all control. And that's what Moses did. He got mad at the people. And really, if you read the verses right before he gave his little speech, he didn't even look upset. He'd gone to the tabernacle. He'd fallen on his face. He'd prayed to God, basically. But somewhere between coming out of that tabernacle and getting to the rock, Moses' fuse got lit. That ever happened to you? Somebody says something to you that just sets you off and you totally lose control? Just out of your mind for a minute? Oh, I'm sure. It's nothing but imagination, but I can just imagine as the people were around this tabernacle, it wasn't like Moses was doing this in a vacuum. I can just imagine them making a line like we see these protesters sometimes, and Moses and Aaron trooping back along, right back along amongst the people, and them shouting these complaints that they had and blaming it on Moses. Besides showing the terrible result of unbridled anger, this account also illustrates the need for precise obedience. And that's something we don't like to talk about as a group of humans. We want to get 90% of it right and hope the other 10% works out, right? But that's not the way this lesson was taught. God does not allow His followers to choose which parts of His decrees they will follow. Half-hearted obedience is no obedience at all. I appreciate your attention. I'm sorry it went a little long, but appreciate you being here.